Back in Da Nang, Vietnam, I didn't grow up like normal kids did. I pretty much stayed at home with my mom and spent most of my time by her side. I rarely left my house and I was really, really isolated. At that time, I didn't know any sign language. I didn't even go to school, so it was really hard to get by. I was on my own a lot and kind of living in a vacuum. I wasn't learning at all. I had absolutely no education, and I was completely illiterate. I didn't even know what my own name was. I did go to a school once to check it out to see what it was like, sort of as a visiting student. And I got to see what they did there, but I still had no concept of what school and education was all about. I remember this one time when the kids went out to play, I would try to communicate with them and say that I wanted to play soccer, and I was able to do that. But other than that, I pretty much just stayed at home on my own with my family. Growing up, I was very isolated and had no type of social stimulation whatsoever. I would just stay at home and do things around the house, and it was kind of like my mind went numb. Eventually, my horizons did broaden as I became more social and I got involved with more people and more social activities. But
So that was the first time that I was mainstreamed, was when I was in London. I continued as a deaf student in the mainstream high school. It was very isolating and lonely and frustrating. When I was at school, I had no support, no note takers, no support services, no interpreters. It was really tough.
How did I realize that my life was out of control? I was actually oblivious to it. My mom died when I was 5 or 6, and it was Halloween night. As I said, it was traumatizing, and I wasn't dealing with my mom's death at all. Afterward, I pretended everything was fine. For many years, I wouldn't accept it. I got into a lot of trouble and a lot of difficult situations, and I was frustrated because I couldn't communicate at home. But when I got to the American School for the Deaf, I finally felt comfortable. It was like I belonged. I could finally talk with people in a natural way through ASL. It wasn't until 1996 when I graduated from high school. Remember how I said I never dealt with my mom's suicide? Well, as soon as I finally faced my mom's death, my world fell apart and I was out of control. My emotions totally overwhelmed me. I started using heroin, smoking pot, and abusing alcohol, and I have no idea why that was. But in retrospect, I think that it made me feel good. It was the first time that I actually felt happy. I started using heroin because my brother was constantly in and out of jail for many years. He was the head of a gang and found himself incarcerated for many years because of that. At that point, I had my own apartment. My brother was just released and had no place to live, and back then I didn't really understand what addiction meant. I knew that drugs were bad because you'd see that in movies and TV. People would always talk about how bad drugs were. Then my brother moved in and I offered him a place to stay to live in exchange for a heroin fix every day. If he didn't give me heroin, then I threatened to kick him out. So that led to my addiction. I used heroin every day, and for a long time I'd hibernate for hours and hours at a time. I would sleep at an average of 16 hours a night. I'd wake up, I'd get my fix, and if I didn't have heroin, I'd get dope sick. I hardly ever left the house. For example, at that time, if my family was having a birthday party for my nieces and nephews, I would rarely go. I remember my nephew and niece when they were little, and then all of a sudden it was like I blinked my eyes and they were all grown up. I missed their childhood because of my addiction. I don't know if I blamed myself for messing up my life, but I do know that I never felt good about myself. Because my mom passed away, because I'm deaf, because I experienced sexual abuse, because my father was an alcoholic and abused me. My biological father abandoned me, and he never came back to visit for years and years. I would sit there by the window and wait for him to come back, but he never did. I always thought there was something wrong with me. I didn't know if it was because I was deaf or something else. I also felt really lonely because I couldn't easily communicate with people. But I never thought about blaming myself. I just always felt like I wasn't good enough.
Before I started on the path of recovery, when I was younger, I used to behave in ways that were not safe to other individuals or to myself. I hurt myself and I hurt other people as well. I often threw things, hit things, and I had a history of hearing voices and experiencing hallucinations. I believe this started when I was around 10. When I started hearing these voices, I figured this was pretty normal, and I thought everyone heard these voices, and it was just that nobody really talked about it. Later, these voices became a lot more negative. Initially, they started delivering a more positive message, and I felt that they were keeping me company. But as the voices turned more negative, and I felt that they were turning against me, that became an entirely different issue. When I was young, I went to a camp for deaf kids. Our counselors wanted to give us the liberating experience of having a whole month without having to wear our hearing aids. But the experience for me was deeply unpleasant, because even without my hearing aids, I continued to hear these intrusive voices. But I never bothered to ask anyone else if they were hearing voices as well. And then after camp, I went and saw my therapist, and I asked her if this was normal to hear these voices, even if you're not wearing a hearing aid. And she told me it was not normal. In fact, it was actually a mental health problem. The fact that I was hearing these voices.
My recovery didn't really start the first time that I hit bottom. When I was initially discharged from the hospital the first time, I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't really understand until almost 20 years later, when I hit bottom for the second time. At that time, I went for treatment voluntarily. And that was when I learned through my therapist who signed and knew how to work with deaf people that there was now something called peer support. And there were interpreting services available. And that didn't exist for me 20 years ago. It wasn't until about 2006, I would say, when I was starting to find goals and find a job that I was enjoying. So MRC suggested I go to the recovery learning community for a job in the learning recovery community. And when I went there, I met the director of recovery services, and she had a diagnosis, which was bipolar. And I didn't realize everyone who worked there had a diagnosis. And I thought, my goodness, this is a peer support. No judgment, no labeling. It felt a little bit better for me, and I didn't feel crazy. And I was told that this was part of my recovery, that it would lead me to better self-esteem, positive self-feelings. So I thought about it for a while, and I talked with a friend of mine, and I had some questions about how peer support could lead to recovery, and they asked me a very direct question. They asked me whether I accepted my own mental illness diagnoses. and I was really rejecting that label up to that point. But then they asked me whether or not I thought other deaf people out there had similar experiences, and whether my experience might be able to help people. When they said that, I literally got chills. Not only accepting my deaf identity, but also accepting my mental health status was necessary if I wanted to help other deaf people. I had to embrace myself first. For the longest time, I had been struggling with being sort of in the closet in the deaf community with my diagnoses. If I wanted to help people, I realized that I had to come to terms with it, and then I had to accept it. And I really need to not only accept it, but be proud of myself. And that was part of a learning process. In order to help other people, I had to come out of the closet in the sense of who I am in order to effectively do outreach in the deaf community. So that was really how I started recognizing what was going on, and that led to changes in my life, like going back to college and feeling, in a sense,
I have gained a lot of insight from my experience, and from that, I'd like to tell people that you don't have to live in the darkness of isolation. You do not have to be alone. You can take charge of your life and think in a positive way about who you are and what you want to become in your life and in your future. And you can apply that to whatever you want to achieve in terms of your career goals or really anything. Please don't let other people discriminate against you or keep you down or tell you that you can't do what you want to do. In your heart, you need to know that this is your life and you can achieve whatever you put your mind to.
My message for people out there who are struggling in their lives is never give up hope. There's always someone there to help you get support and get you back on your feet again. And remember, always ask for help. And the message I'd like to share with people is that even if you feel lonely and you're grieving and you feel like you're isolated and have nobody to support you, you have to toss that mentality. There are resources available. Without the support that I have, I wouldn't be here today. I am so grateful for the support that I have, and I know that you have it too. You just have to look for it. You have to look inside of yourself and recognize that we all have supports in our lives. And I know you can do it. I have been through it myself, and I know you can too.
The deaf community needs to come together and help each other out. Kind of like the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Martin Luther King was the leader who called the black community together, and the result was getting equal rights. So if the deaf community comes together and we support each other and work together, we could all lift each other up in the same way.